Ever since 2011, Monstercat has been an ever-growing brand full of fantastic music over the years, and has even taken on some iconic names that have gone on to make huge careers for themselves. It's a label that isn't afraid to try something new when the opportunity is open to do so, and in many people's eyes this can mean a lot of things. For one, it can mean their recent divulgence into TikTok-focused music such as sped up or slowed down versions of certain songs. It could also mean their early interest in the NFT space with things like relics, and even something like introducing more artists/music that appealed to the rhythm crowd, a subgenre of dubstep that was previously pretty rare to find on the label. Despite these more recent examples, this drive to constantly grow and change has pretty much always been the case since the label's creation. Everything from the inception of the genre colors, to the evolution of the iconic visualizer, and even the introduction of albums. And of course, I'm not talking about their plethora of compilations that the label itself curates, but rather the fully fledged records produced by the artists themselves. In this new series, we will take a look at each and every single one of these albums that Monstercat has released over the years and break them down based on both public knowledge of the album, as well as giving my own personal take on certain tracks throughout. If you already know these albums, then feel free to join me for the ride as I try my best to pick at all the little details. If you don't know or haven't heard of these albums before, think of this series as just kind of my formal opinion mixed with little factoids here and there, and based on that you can decide whether or not it is worth checking out on your own time. For today's episode, let's dive into the very first Monstercat LP, or long play for short, that was ever released, Haywyre's Twofold Part 1. Twofold Part 1 was produced by Indiana-based artist Martin Vogt, aka Haywyre, and was released on March 31st, 2014. The artwork of the album was created by 3D artist with the handle Everyday Swiss, who also produced an alternative artwork for the record that ended up being rejected by Monstercat. This alternative piece features the head of a goat that strikes resemblance to Haywyre's 2011 sophomore record, Dub Sonic. And if that wasn't enough, there's even a version of this that includes the rainbow horns just like the ones in the Dub Sonic art. Twofold Part 1 also features artists like CoMa, Xorro, and Galimatias. And for those of you who are wondering about the pronunciation of that last name, I tried all I could to find the proper pronunciation of it, and I was led to this interview from B-Sides with Peter Marr, where Angeline from the show explicitly says the name.
Hi, I'm Angeline, and I'm hanging out with Gali today, aka Galimatias. Thank you so much for joining me.
So I hope that's the right pronunciation going forward, and I apologize if it isn't. Twofold Part 1 consists of 8 total tracks that span roughly 33 minutes in length. While this is seen as short by album standards, and I don't disagree, let's remember that this was the very first Monstercat album. And you could interpret this album's release as sort of a testing the waters thing to see if this is something people would actually be interested in listening to. It's also worth noting that this LP is technically no longer released under the Monstercat brand, meaning it exists outside of the label nowadays, but many people, including myself, still consider it the first true Monstercat album, hence why we are talking about it today. Finally, if you view the album under the Haywyre SoundCloud and read the description, you can read the following passage. We are defined by our actions and thoughts, but also by what we don't do and think. Similarly, silence defines music just as much as sound itself. This relationship between absence and presence that characterizes our life is the philosophical foundation of Twofold Part 1. These tracks explore duality through simplicity and complexity, organic and synthetic, energetic and calm. Without further ado, let's hop on into the track list. The album begins with Prologue Part 1, a beautiful 2-minute and 10-second piano piece that opens up the album and was all done by Haywyre himself. Despite the heavy uses of electronic production throughout his music, he is also a very skilled pianist with plenty of proof to back it up. As far as the song goes, it very much is an introduction to the rest of the album entirely played through piano, alongside some very faint static that gives it more of an authentic sound and quality, almost as if it's all being done in one take, which would not surprise me at the least. I personally love the progression of this piano, as well as how it builds itself up leading into the album's first full-length tune, as well as its lead single. The Schism was released on March 10th, 2014, exactly 3 weeks before the release of Twofold Part 1. It was also featured on Monstercat 017 Ascension, as well as Monstercat's 3-year anniversary compilation. A schism usually refers to a division between two strongly opposed sides. The most common examples include having two opposite opinions or religious views. Right from the title, we already have an example of that core theme of duality that Haywyre talked about in his statement about the album. In a near seamless transition from the previous track, the song opens up with this guitar lead that immediately pulls you into the atmosphere of the album, given the first track didn't do that already. On a personal note, this is my favorite track of the entire record. The way it comes together and all the moments outside of the main drops are what make the song really stand out to me among the rest of the tracklist here. For a song that stretches nearly 5.5 minutes, it's got enough going for it that you never really feel bored while listening to it. That's of course me standing on my own 2 feet about it, but also a sentiment carried by most people that have listened to the song, even before the album's release. And I haven't even brought up the drops themselves yet because even after a decade since its release, they still go hard as hell. In my mind, The Schism truly feels like the core of the album. In other words, it's the song that makes it the most difficult to imagine the album without it. In another seamless transition, we arrive at the third track, titled Dichotomy Soft Mix. For those that don't know, a dichotomy is a division or contrast between two things that are either mutually exclusive or contradictory to one another. Once again reinforcing this idea of duality that flows through the entire record. You could also use the existence of both a soft mix and a hard mix as yet another example of this idea. With that in mind, the hard mix never actually made it onto the album, and there's actually a pretty interesting story behind why. According to the Monstercat wiki, the hard mix was actually meant to be the version that was put on the album instead of what we know to be the soft mix. However, a Reddit user by the name of Perez Ronaldo leaked the track ahead of the album's release, and as a result, Monstercat co-founder and CEO Mike Darlington banned Perez Ronaldo from the label subreddit and replaced it with the soft mix. This was furthermore an unfortunate event in Darlington's case because the hard mix was one of his favorite songs on the entire album. Fortunately though, the hard mix did not die in vain, as it became a free download track off of Haywyre's Bandcamp page. Back to the soft mix, it's important that you don't let the title fool you. When it comes to the softer drops on here, they actually are really nice and lush, and have this almost ethereal quality to them. However, the second drop is exactly why I say don't underestimate the term soft mix. The third drop does a really nice job of reeling it back into the softer soundscape, this time with the addition of this catchy little woodwind throughout. As it stands, I honestly prefer the soft mix over the hard mix, as I think it fits the sonic landscape of the record a bit better. But in the context of duality that Haywyre was going for with this record, I can understand why the hard mix was the original choice. As we get our first hard cut into the following track, we are introduced to the album's second and final proper single, Sculpted, which was released on March 24th, 2014, exactly 1 week before the release of the album. Most noteworthy piece of information I have when it comes to this song is that it's the first song on the record where we're introduced to any sort of vocal presence. Everything up to this point has been purely instrumental, and the sudden addition of vocals towards the halfway point of the album might be a tad jarring on first listen. However, I want to point out the lyrics here because on top of the thick vocoding that's done to Haywyre's voice, the words themselves give the song a bit more meaning than just to sound cool. That passage is read a few times throughout the song and are the only words spoken throughout. With that in mind though, it basically tells you not to let the pressure of society sculpt who you are, but rather it is your responsibility to create the person that you want to and aspire to be. Hence the line, separate who you are from who you want to be. I also enjoy the little nod to the album's final track, Voice of Reason, in the line before it. Let your voice of reason break your boundaries. I also want to highlight the main drop that comes in immediately after because it just sounds awesome. Outside of the incredible production that all of these songs have, I don't really have much else to comment here. And I don't want to spoil every drop for those that haven't yet experienced this record in full, so I think it's just best to move on. Doppelgänger is next up on the track list and is also the release upload for this album. Just as a side note, whenever I say release upload, I'm talking about the song that was showcased on the Monstercat YouTube channel to commemorate the release of the project. Or in other words, the song you see on their YouTube channel that marks the release of whatever project it's related to. This song is one of the few blatant references to the album's theme of duality. The song's title, Doppelgänger, which simply translates to double walker, typically referring to a ghostly duplicate of yourself. The song itself also embodies this idea, as the first half is definitely more energetic and lively than its much calmer counterpart within the second half. Much like the Schism, this track is another example of a song that most people immediately think of when they think of this record as a whole. It may not be one of my personal favorites from the LP, but it's definitely a track that even without the rest of the album in mind, works really well on its own due to how catchy and fun it is. Of course I could really say that for any track on here, but would that really have been worth the time? Now we arrive at track number 6, titled Time, featuring vocals from CoMa. This one, as well as the very next song which we'll get to here in a minute, takes the album in more of a house direction and is also the longest song on the tracklist, just surpassing the Schism by about 11 seconds. The main thing about this track that pulls me in personally is the garage-style production, a genre you don't typically hear from someone like Haywyre. However, he fully embraces it here with some really smooth production. And although her presence on this album is small, the vocals from CoMa do help the track. With that being said though, I never quite understood these lyrics from her. Maybe the answer is right in front of me and I'm too blind to see it. Outside of that, I really do enjoy the song, and it's a nice change of pace from what the album has been building up to so far. Maybe not the most innovative or stylistic song on the record, but you can tell that it comes from the heart and it even sounds like they had a ton of fun working on it. Yet another song that I believe describes this idea of duality is Permutate, which features Illinois-based producer Xorro. For those who don't know, permutate means to rearrange or simply change the order or sequence of something, usually described under mathematical terms as permutation. The thing I find the most interesting about this track is the fact that it, alongside the previous track Time, also work together as yet another example of duality. This is more or less speculation territory, however, it is worth noting that with the context in mind, pairing the only two house songs on the record right next to each other makes a ton of sense. You have Time, which is very soft and melodic with no real deviation from that overall atmosphere, whereas Permutate aims to be pretty much the exact opposite and does so in style. Both Haywyre and Xorro managed to make this arguably the darkest song on the whole record in terms of the overall sound design and atmosphere of the track. In addition to that, the song never truly deviates from its main sound and overall vibe, even if the second drop does add a slight bit of melodic flair. As someone who personally enjoys this song, it's not going to be a song for everybody, and I do personally find it one of the weaker cuts here. With that being said though, it does enough to warrant at least a good foot thumping from time to time. As the LP's final song, Voice of Reason features Danish-born LA-based producer Galimatias. A voice of reason is a common English idiom that refers to a person who provides calm, logical advice, often within a heated situation. Someone that can see the bigger picture and help make the most reasonable and sound choices. It marks as the second shortest track on the record with a runtime just under 4 minutes. I know that sounds kinda crazy for the second shortest track on the LP, but remember that the shortest is still Prologue Part 1 sitting at 2 minutes and 10 seconds, nearly 2 whole minutes apart from one another. This track, however, separates itself from pretty much the rest of the tracklist by being this more mellow, laid-back beat with lush chords and synths to carry it throughout. The vocal here also carries some significance as we constantly hear these repeated phrases. This possibly infers that whomever these statements are directed towards aren't listening to their voice of reason, and as we remember from the track Sculpted, voice of reason ends with this sound as it plays until the very last second where it cuts off and effectively concludes the album. Conclusion. As Monstercat's first album release, not only does it still hold up today as one of the best projects from this era of its history, but it also acts as the catapult that launched the ever-growing roster of Monstercat LPs that are still growing to this very day. For a record that was released nearly 11 years ago, the quality of it holds up tremendously well, and each track still sounds so expertly crafted. Even though I wouldn't call this a perfect album by any means, it definitely holds a special place in my heart, and it made me appreciate Haywyre for giving Monstercat fans a sound that was truly unique and fascinating to the EDM scene during this period. The themes and concepts of duality, opposites, and contrasts presented throughout the record was something that made this album stand out to me, and I found it a captivating idea while listening through, and given the nature of the title Twofold Part 1, it probably wouldn't surprise you that he would later release a sequel album nearly 2 years later in February 2016, appropriately titled Twofold Part 2. Unfortunately, this is not the next album I will be diving into for this series. I am going in chronological order, so join me next time as we dive into Varian's debut Monstercat album, The Ancient and Arcane. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. This is a new series that I want to start where I cover every single Monstercat album that has ever been released, so let me know what you think of this episode down in the comments below, and until then, I'll see you next time.